Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be exploring some abandoned places, so get your flashlight ready because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I grew up in Yuki, northern New South Wales. We lived in the bush in an area dotted with abandoned homes and cottages. Some of these were completely isolated and cut off from any roads. I loved taking my dogs for bushwalks. Sometimes we would find these houses and usually give them a wide berth, as they weren't always unoccupied and sometimes inhabited by unsavory types. This is a true story. I have tried to be as true in telling it as memory serves. So not far from my childhood home, there is an empty house. It sits on a sea of green ferns and tall grasses, with a veranda that encircles 3 of its hexagonal walls, clad in earthy brown timbers. It is an artificial island surrounded by an encroaching regiment of native gun and grasping lantana. Access to civilization was cut off years ago, when the old wooden bridge that connected the property to the outside world surrendered to the inexorable marching of time and decay. A faded 64 XM Falcon sits in the garage under a mouldy green tarp, hastily tossed across the rusted bonnet. The house comes with all the trappings of occupancy, but its owners have long since vanished. A suffocating silence chastises intrusion, and no one ever goes there. It was Amy who introduced me to the empty house where no one goes. I had been wasting the long summer mining for coal on RuneScape. I had spent hours slumped in that office chair, eyes glued to the screen, absently clicking the new cold spawn. We were in the opening days of the new year of 2007 and had just upgraded from dial-up to broadband. I was finally allowed a MySpace account as I was starting high school in a few short weeks. By that point of the holidays, I'd stomached all of the video games I could handle, and being the youngest in the family meant that I should relish the opportunity to be included by my older sister and her friends. She'd burst into the office full of her usual vivacity and snapping me out of my reverie. "Hey Rob, me and Aaron are going for a walk, you want to come?" I quickly agreed. A little adventure would definitely break up the tedium. We followed our dusty dirt road as it wound its way down the western shoulder of heavily forested hills. A few people lived nearby, and it would have been quiet, if not for the rather raucous buzzing that belonged to the army of cicadas that set the summer air vibrating. Zeta and Tanner led the way, their tails wagging, their noses low to the ground. They'd stop every so often, turning and waiting to make sure we weren't falling behind. 1 red and 1 blue. Cattle dogs which loved nothing more than the promise of adventure. The air grew cooler as we descended towards the gully floor. Amy and Aaron chatted loudly, carefree and boisterous. Suddenly, the sound of something crashing through dry undergrowth interrupted the apparent peace. Birds erupted from their perches above us, and we stopped in our tracks. The dogs never missed a beat, crashing madly down the hillside, leaping over fallen logs and racing out of sight. There was the sound of Tana yipping excitedly for a moment, then silence. The silence stretched for a moment before I saw a flash of red and blue, as the dogs raced across a stretch of open grass far below. "It looks like there's a paddock down there. They may be after horses," I said, trying to sound casual. Many of the people who lived on the property surrounding our home were of the reclusive, unsavory breed. They would not welcome trespassing dogs or children on their property, and the idea of a confrontation left us feeling uneasy. We quickly began negotiating a way down in the direction our furry friends had vanished. It wasn't before long we'd made our own very loud way down the slope. The dogs suddenly appeared ahead, looking excited but sheepish, the chase apparently over. "There they are," Erin exclaimed. Bad dogs, I growled, doing my best prepubescent attempt at a deep and threatening voice. Zita joined us, panting slightly, but otherwise nonchalant in the face of my rebuke. I ruffled her ears and looked ahead. A couple of chestnut-coated mares, cloistered and presently ignoring us, stood at the end of a small paddock, split by a small stream. On the other side of the stream, a mob of wallabies peered warily from the shadows cast by tall trees bordering the enclosure. The sound of water bubbling over rocks could be heard in their direction. As one, the wallabies turned and bounded into the gloom, gone as quickly as they had appeared. I've never been down here, said Amy. Let's go and see what's down that creek. After several minutes, we passed into the shadows of the trees. It was quieter here, the earlier cacophony of cicadas forgotten. The creek tumbled its noisy way down a rock face and burbled its way into a deep pool before winding onwards into the relative darkness of the forest. Up ahead, through the heavy branches of camphor laurel trees, the dark walls of a house were suddenly visible. Curious, we made our way upwards, leaving the shelter of the trees and getting a clearer view of the enigmatic building. The house was double-storied with a large veranda. It was a beautiful structure, though it was immediately clear that it was unoccupied. The grass was waist-height, spotted with creeping lumps of lantana. Ferns were everywhere, clinging to the shadows of the few saplings that dared to leave the protective fringe that surrounded the clearing. A prickle teased the back of my neck and I shivered. A small voice inside urged me to turn around and go home, but our inquisitive nature won us over, and we ventured forwards. We were suddenly subdued, yet could not tell why. The air felt thick, heavy, and hot. We passed on tiptoes under the leeward side of the wooden house and passed under its balcony, where the door frame yawned open. The door hung uselessly off broken hinges. Within, darkness reigned. We halted upon the threshold, but advanced no further. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared to, despite our apparent isolation. An old sink, filled with cobwebs and grime, stood on one side of a walkway parallel to a set of cupboards with wooden slatted doors. They hung open, revealing layers of dust, webs, and a dead rat, as well as a small collection of tin containers. A narrow set of stairs wound its way to the upper level at the end of a passageway littered with debris. The mood was heavy, stifling, and uncomfortable. I felt an overwhelming sense that I needed to get out of there. We were uninvited guests, poised upon a threshold of animosity, and the promise of retribution seemed almost tangible. Malevolent eyes watched quietly from every hidden corner. There's a garage over there. Erin's quiet voice broke the silence, falling flat and unwelcome as the rest of us. We gingerly made our way through the long grass towards the old garage, our necks rubber banding, on constant watch for snakes or other more sinister denizens of the empty house. An old rope swing hung from the tired limbs of an old tree, swaying listlessly in an imperceptible breeze. A car was parked inside the garage, its original green-blue coat faded almost beyond recall. A Rego sticker clung tenaciously to the corner of the windshield. 8 years expired. We edged past it, skirting an assortment of old bric-a-brac typical to a carport, and ducked under a roller door still half open. I breathed an involuntary exclamation. The entire room housed rows of strange, monochrome machinery. Dials and buttons adorned their faces, dozens of electrical cords bound them together. Dust blanketed everything. "What is it?" Amy questioned. "It looks like some sort of recording and broadcasting equipment." The certainty in my voice surprised me. "It's very old, 30 years or more if I had to guess at the time." I think I must have seen something in a magazine once. Who owns all this stuff? Aaron whispered in a small voice. And why did they leave? His question was left unanswered. A house, a car, ancient, yet no doubt expensive radio equipment. All of it left without warning or any sign of taking the time to secure it. Nothing was locked or covered up. If it was the original inhabitants, he had simply vanished. We spent some minutes wandering up and down the aisles, touching nothing, fearing that the old machines would burst back into life at any moment. I caught myself holding my breath and turned to face the others. Let's see if we can see anything inside the house from the veranda. We went back outside, feeling no less suffocated. A wide set of steps led up to the deck. The wood was old, yet still sturdy. The roof had remained intact and kept its timbers dry. We stopped to peer through the kitchen window. The second level of the house was mostly open-planned, with a generously sized kitchen and living room. I half expected to see the table set up for dinner. All sense of the mundane ended there. Splintered timber covered every surface. Even the floor hadn't been spared. I could see the first floor below through the gaping wooden wounds. The hair on my arms was standing on the end of the dull thrumming of my heart as it roared in my ears. It looked like an axe-wielding madman had torn the place apart. "There's a phone on the counter," whispered Amy. It was a landline-style Aristel phone, typical of the late 90s. An off-white with grey rectangular buttons. Its tightly wound, curly cord was plugged into the wall. On impulse, I slid open the unlocked window and snatched the phone from the cradle and raised my ear. There was a dial tone, I mouthed, scarcely believing it. Tentatively, I dialed the 8 digits home. "Is it ringing?" Amy asked. A bead of sweat ran down her pale face, her white knuckles visible on the windowsill. I nodded, waiting with bated breath. "No answer," I declared, putting the phone back on the hook. "Let's go in," when suddenly there was a ring. No one said anything. No one breathed so much. My eyes darted from Amy to Aaron and then back to the phone. It never occurred to me to answer. I wasn't waiting to find out who was on the other end. Amy and Aaron were already halfway down the stairs, tripping over the dogs in a hurry to get out. I raced after them, my heart hammering in my throat, as an explosion of adrenaline carried me away from the malevolent ruin on frenzied wings. We didn't stop running until we got home. Winded, sweat-streaked, and dirty, we collapsed onto the couch. "Hello, you three," Aaron screamed in terror, but it was only my mum standing in the doorway and looking around, rather amused. The stories spilled out of us, one interrupting another, in the rush to recount the morning's events. And then, "I tried to call you, but you didn't answer. And then it rang. Mum, it rang." Mum laughed. "Well, that was very strange. But I know who called you back. The phone rang 20 minutes ago. I didn't recognize the number, so I hit redial, but then no one answered." I sighed with relief. My imagination momentarily assured. "But if you weren't able to use the phone?" Mum said that meant the phone line is still connected, which also means someone's paying the phone bill. If someone comes home and checks their message banks, they could return my call. Images of our own home, with axe-riven walls torn apart by an eldritch nightmare, flashed through my mind. My mouth went dry. What if they hit redial? "You left a message?" Thankfully, there was never a return call or a visitor as a result of our trip. I went back in 2020, and the house showed signs of previous inhabitants, likely squatters, with wrappers of food that had expired in 2016. The phone was now gone, but it left me with more questions than answers. This happened in Sydney, Australia, around 2016. I was 14 years old, and there was an abandoned house in the corner of my suburban street. It wasn't like your 100-year-old house that was decaying. It was fairly modern and had been abandoned fairly recently. Old lady passed away, I think. Me and two of my friends, Jackson and Harley, used to walk past it on our way home from school, and on one occasion, being the naughty teens that we are, we'd thought we'd jump the fence and check out the house. We managed to make our way into the house through a side window that was broken, and I remember that Harley found a screwdriver and removed the lock to the back door so that we could get out that way. Whoever lived in this house had obviously been a hoarder. It was your classic newspapers and letters stacked up in the living room sort of deal. We searched through a bunch of the rooms, and Jackson and I snagged some old jewelry that we found. There was also a basement to the house that was a bit dusty and had a bunch of old kids' toys and stuff like that in it. We didn't go down there much as it smelt pretty bad and was just kind of gross in general. It became a regular thing from there on that we would enter the house after school and just hang out, look around at all the old stuff. It was never overly creepy or anything, but it did have just an off feeling about it. There were picture frames of people I never knew on the walls, and seeing these random people just sort of smiling out at you always made me feel a bit uneasy, especially since we were technically infiltrating this home. There were a few occasions when I would be walking home from school alone because my friend had other activities or I was coming back late, and I would never work up the courage to enter the house alone, but would often stare up at the kitchen window from the side path, half expecting to see some ghostly figure staring back down at me. Anyway, one day Jason and his family had gone over to Harley's for a barbecue. Their parents were good friends, I believe, and they messaged me on Instagram around 8 p.m. asking if I wanted to go back to the abandoned house. I only lived about 2 streets away from them, so said sure, and I went out to meet them. We met up out the front and made our way into the house through the usual back door. I was a bit nervous because we had never been into this house at night before, but we had our flashlights on our phones, and it seemed less scary with all 3 of us just laughing and joking around. We entered the house and began our usual routine of looking around for anything cool. We were joking and making light of the situation, searching through some old letters and boxes for anything worth taking home, or at least taking a picture of. At some point I start recording on my phone. I can't remember why exactly. We were all hanging out in the kitchen area, and Harley is mid-joke when all of a sudden we hear multiple rapid knocks from the floorboards directly below us. Without sparing each other so much as a glance, we bolt out of the kitchen and through the back door. The back door was on a balcony and staircase, but I was in such a panic to get out of the house, I jumped off the balcony and landed on my ass, but didn't care at the time. We scrambled over each other trying to get back to the main road, and once we did, we went straight home. The next day we talked about it at school. It all seemed hilarious now that it was the daytime, and we laughed about how I had jumped off the balcony and bruised my ass. But we did never go back to the house, despite still walking past it on the way home from school. I still had the video on my phone that I had recorded, and you can hear the knocks in the video. I'm curious if the house is still around 7 years later now. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, literally. Cornfields and cows, with the occasional sprinkling of houses filled with people who tended to the cows and cornfields. So, as any teenager in the country would do, I spent a lot of time exploring abandoned buildings, houses, barns, restaurants, anything I could get into. I had just got a new job in a town I didn't usually go to, and of course immediately asked the locals about the scary stories in the town. I was told over and over again a story from the 80s of a woman who caught her husband cheating and came home one day and blew his brains out with a shotgun while he slept. She then went on to hang herself in a tree behind the house. According to local legend, the police has never even cleaned the crime scene. They removed the bodies, but there were too many pieces of the husband left behind on the floor and wall. Immediately I'm interested. I asked where the house was, and surprised to learn it was only minutes from where I was working. Now don't get me wrong, I felt brave, but as a young female wasn't about to explore this haunted murder house by myself. I texted some friends of mine and asked them to meet me there that night. They of course had nothing else to do, so agreed. I got off work at around 10 p.m. and met my friends in front of the house. It was a small white farmhouse, heavily overgrown with weeds and barely visible from the road. I had no idea how we were going to get in, but I knew I had to see what was inside. Me and my 3 friends, 2 guys and 1 girl, looked all around until my one guy friend found a window that wasn't locked. He was far too large to crawl through, so my smaller guy friend crawled through and unlocked the back door. We climbed through the weeds and made our way back into the house. By the light of our flashlights, we began to explore. The house seemed untouched. There were dishes in the sink and old boxes of food in the cabinets. The walls were a mixture of yellow from long-term smoking and patches of brown, which could have been mold or could have been pieces of husband, but I wasn't about to touch it to find out. My guy friends took off to the bedroom, and my girlfriend and I looked for the basement. After some searching, we found the steps to the basement. It was dark and cave-like, unfinished, with lights dangling from the ceiling that mostly hadn't been switched on in decades. The basement had 2 sections. The first one you were immediately in was a laundry/washroom. Then behind that was an open storage room. This is where things started to really turn. We walked into the storage room and were met by a giant red painted pentagram on the floor. There were shelves all over the walls, filled with what appeared to be jars of dead animal parts and blood. There were half-burned candles, upside-down crosses, and notebooks that were falling apart from years of moisture and mold in the air. Suffice to say, we were creeped out. It wasn't until we were older that I understood what I had seen, but at the time, I didn't know too much about the rituals they were most likely performing in the basement. I have no way of knowing if the husband and wife had done this, or if it had been done by a fellow trespasser, but it didn't seem to be very recent. We decided we had had enough of the creepy basement and head upstairs, only to be greeted by the loud sound of shattering glass. One of my guy friends had decided to grab a bat from his car and bust out the old TV. We both screamed at him to stop. Yes, I've definitely trespassed, but I've never vandalized. After taking a few more swings, he stops, and instead of turning around to yell at me, he starts staring out of the kitchen window behind me, his face absolutely terrified. Thinking he's messing with me, I tell him to stop being weird and that we needed to leave before the cops came and saw his mess. At this time, my friend shifts his gaze from the window and looks at me. He points back to the window and says, "What is that?" I laugh again, thinking he's trying to scare me, but he doesn't laugh. Finally, I turn around and see movement in the field behind us, slowly getting closer to the house. We all stand at the window waiting for whatever it was to come out of the field and into the open part of the backyard. A few seconds go by before we see a woman in a long grey nightgown holding a brick in her hand, running towards the back window. At this point, she was mere feet away, and we all ducked down below the window thinking she was going to throw the brick through it, and we needed to try and avoid the shards of glass. And she did. The window shattered so loud my ears started to ring, but I didn't feel any of the glass. After a few seconds, we all stood up and looked through the hole where the window once was. The woman was gone, and the glass from the shattered window was outside on the lawn. She threw the brick at the window, but the window broke out instead of in. We all shared a collective "screw this" and ran out of the house back to our cars. We spoke about it a few times, but never to anyone else, since we were convinced they wouldn't believe us. The house had been torn down now, and the lot is now an extension of the field from behind it. I don't know exactly what we saw that night, but I'm certainly glad the house no longer stands. I live in the UK, and relatively near where I live is an old mental asylum. It's been abandoned and run down for quite a good few years now, and is patrolled by an old guy with a big dog, who apparently is the caretaker or owns the land, although he's usually only there during the day, and at night goes home. The asylum was featured on an episode of Most Haunted a good few years back, which makes the place ripe for attention from the locals in the twilight hours once the patrolling dude is gone. I'd only been a few times prior to this. It was usually relatively busy, but usually infested with thrill-seeking teenagers and a few potheads looking for a quiet place to get stoned without hassle from the local authorities. Occasionally, you would get a few groups of troublemakers trying to start fights, but if you're in a group, you were usually okay. I think in 2018, me and a group of friends and my girlfriend decided to go there on Halloween night for some ghost hunting. We ended up going way later than intended, so it was actually 2 AM on November 1st when we got there, but hey, no biggie. We dodged the crowds. There were 5 of us: myself, my girlfriend Kesha, my friend Adam, and his girlfriend Merape, and his other friend Dustin. There's a small section of tree line you need to follow to get to the entrance, so we start heading through that when we saw a bunch of guys walking over. Dustin starts stressing, thinking it's the police, because it technically was trespassing, but me and Adam start reassuring him it's fine. One of the dudes starts shouting something like, "Security, stay where you are." He doesn't sound like he's local to here, but that doesn't really mean anything necessarily. However, Adam, who comes here a lot, as he lives a 3-minute walk away, just replies with, "They don't have security here, good try mate." And the dude laughs and just goes. We all laughed, no big deal there. We go around exploring, but Kesha tells me that after we went past, those 3 guys turned off their flashlights. This place is insanely dark, so that's odd in itself, and she feels as though we're being followed. I tell the others and Dustin freaked out. Adam and Merape assure us it's all fine. Another thing I should note is these guys weren't your average people you would see in this place. They appeared to be in their mid to late 40s, all quite big and broad, and not your usual hangout spot, being an asylum at 2 AM. As we're going around, we hear something landing behind us. We looked, trying to work out what it was, but couldn't see anything. A few more things start landing. Stones were being thrown in our direction from somewhere. We couldn't see where. They kind of figured they were coming from one of the nearby windows and started shouting up at the window a few expletives at whoever was throwing them. They stayed quiet, just occasionally throwing more. After Adam and Kesha both got hit by a stone, we all determined it was time to leave and began to go. Dustin and Kesha basically wanted to run off, but Adam convinced us that they're likely just trying to scare us, so to not run or panic. So we casually walked off, shouting a few expletives, and more stones got hurled our way. We managed to get around the rest of the asylum without much hassle, and had a gander around. We were heading back towards the car via a different route across a field, near the edge, where there was another window. I told the guys that I thought I saw some people coming out of the little door at the bottom. Adam shined his torch over, and sure enough it was the same 3 guys as earlier. No torches on, just seemingly coming from the route we had just taken, almost as if they had been following us. Just to elaborate, as we were entering initially, they were heading towards one of the exits, so it seemed as though they were leaving when we arrived, and then we put 2 and 2 together and concluded that they were the ones likely lobbing stones at us as the projectiles came from a window to the building that we had just been in. We walked back along the field. The dudes followed but slowly, not as if they were trying to catch us or anything. By the time we got to our car, they were out of sight. I don't think these dudes intended to harm us, other than an occasional donk by a stone, likely just trying to frighten us. Either way, me and Morope both felt very on edge. Kesha and Dustin were panicking and stressing the whole way around. Those two were terrified. Adam seemed quite calm about the whole thing, if not a bit annoyed, but it was definitely something that creeped me out, and something that kept us talking for the night. Like, why the hell were they following us? And what were their intentions? Just a little game to have fun at our expense? Or something a bit more sinister that they might have not been able to achieve? What are your thoughts on this? Me and a group of friends. Me a female, my ex-boyfriend, my female friend and the other male. We took a night of visiting abandoned places. So where I live, there are not that many, or they're protected by dogs. I don't fancy having my leg chewed off, so we all dressed in clothes that we knew we could throw away from mold and other things being in places like that, and decided to go to the furthest away one, which was an old abandoned swingers club. Just to clarify, none of us were swingers. We arrived at a petrol station halfway down from the literal mansion, walked down the other side of the motorway, and were greeted by a fence and a small brick wall. We all helped each other get over and supported each other's balance by going through the back. Backstory to this club. A few years ago, some idiots set it on fire because they thought it was funny. So upstairs was caved in, and everywhere looked like it had been mashed up. We got in and walked through the main lobby. A massive swimming pool and pretty artwork on the walls you could just about see. We looked around, took pictures, and we walked out the front, and this is where the first interaction happened. I looked up at the front, and I was the one behind everyone and was taking photos, and someone grabbed my shoulder and yanked it back, but no one was behind me, just the big gates. So I was a little freaked and asked the others if they had felt it, and they all said no. My ex-boyfriend at the time had a bat in his hand, and we walked back in. We were not going to visit the dungeon, but as we walked over there was a clown mask hanging from a rope. Bear in mind it had not been there when we came in. So I literally said, "I'm done with this, I'm out," and I began walking towards the entrance. Before we left, one of the boys had collected a teddy and put it in the car. We didn't drive for more than 5 minutes and the radio and lights went mad on the dashboard, and it didn't take long for us to jettison the teddy out the window. The second building we went to was an old pub. The back was open, so we got through there. Everything looked like it wasn't touched, and they just up and left. I took some pictures of the bar and posed as the barman and women. After we looked around, the two boys wanted to go upstairs, and we said, "Cool beans, we'll wait in the car and watch you." And we watched them, and a tall dark figure was walking around behind them. I tried to call my ex-boyfriend, but it was like trying to get through to someone on a radio. They came back downstairs, and I told them what I saw, and what they said was spine-chilling. So all the floors, a normal bedroom, right? With the mattress all stood up, and proceeds to tell me that when you get to the top floor, it's empty with a chair in the middle, a belt, and a photo of a young girl sat on the empty chair. Nothing else, just a belt and a photo of a young girl. For some reason, I agreed to go back in after that to see it for myself. I got to the stairs and everything on my body froze, and I said, "You know what, I don't want to go." Now, you know, boys being boys arguing with me over the fact that I was scared, but this was my body purely refusing to move. So they said all right and took me back to the car. As we were leaving, a pint glass went flying at one of the boys' heads and the toilet door slammed shut. And when I tell you they ran, they ran. Now, fun fact with this place, it was where the highwayman was born and raised. Turns out I'm somehow related to the guy, but it's highly paranormal in the caves up top. So was it him protecting me as a distant cousin or relative? I'll never know. I am a 28-year-old female. The story I'm about to tell you happened back in 2016 with my best friend Chris. Now, ever since the day Chris and I met, we have always got ourselves in the dumbest things ever. I mean, Chris ran away once and had my nerves all messed up. But he came back because he had no money. I mean, we're not the smartest teens, but we still enjoyed life. One summer night, Chris and I were hanging out, and we were trying to think of a place to explore, like we always did. At the time, I told him I'd never been to the old rock house in Greenwood, South Carolina. Now, before I get started, let me give you a bit of history on the rock house. A man named Thomas Tom Paine Tolbert built a fireproof house back in 1926. After years of family homes burning down, Tolbert lived in the detached kitchen and used the large house to store family heirlooms. Tolbert lived his later years in isolation. The now crumbling fortress is accessible only by foot, and no one has ever lived inside its walls. You can look up way more of the history online if you want. Back to my story. I'd always been told the rock house has many spirits in and around it, but like I said at the time, I'd never been there. So with that, Chris and I took my cousin's car and headed out to the old rock house. I've heard of people going in the daytime, but never heard people say they went at night. We, being dumb, went at night because why not? Ghosts and spirits never bothered me too much, being that I've seen them my whole life. Once we pull up to the woods and park on this side of the road, I get the bad feeling run all over my body. I sat there for a moment. I believe Chris sees this look on my face and asks if I still want to do this. Something is telling me not to get out, but at the same time, I want to see this place even at night. Yeah, let's go see how scary this place is, I told him. Yeah, let's do it, he replied. We get out and start walking through the woods. As we're walking, we have our phones out for light, and we're making jokes and acting silly as we always do. We can never really take anything seriously no matter what, and as we're walking, we don't realize how quiet it is to be in the woods at night, in the middle of summer. We find our way to the front of the house. Chris is in front of me, and we are looking at the house. No front door or windows. All you can see is pure darkness. For some reason, I just can't move, even though Chris is walking to what used to be the door. At this moment I realize we are just in complete darkness with no sound, no animals, no bugs or wind. Just the silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see something moving on the top left window. But before I completely look, I hear something to the left of me and look over, but see nothing. A feeling of dread falls over me. Chris is now at the door of the house and looks inside. I look at the window and there it is. Something is there looking down at me. My body turns cold. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes burning a hole through my soul. Bright, yellow-reddish eyes like fire. All of a sudden I hear Chris say, "Ah, hell no." He turns to run to me, but my body is still frozen. He grabs my wrist and pulls me to run. He never lets me go. As we are running, we are jumping over falling trees and the debris from many travelers to the rock house in the past. As we run, I realize something is running beside us, but I dare not look back. My body is now in pilot mode, and Chris has the grip on my wrist still pulling me. My mind blank, heart racing, and at one point I feel like I can feel the breath of whatever's chasing us. The moment we make it to the car, everything comes back to me, and I'm back in control of my mind and body. We jump in the car, and Chris goes to start it. He had his face covered in the steering wheel as he tries to start the car, but it's dead. We start freaking out, my head buried between my legs, and Chris still hiding his face. "This is it, Chris. This is how we die, because of dumb stuff like this." Chris yelled at me to shut up, that we're not going to die and the car will start. I can feel this thing outside the car. Just there. Is this why there are so many spirits here? Does it take the souls of the people it's caught? I feel it looking at us. Something wants me to look at it, but at the same time a voice in my head is telling me not to. I want to cry. The car starts, and Chris tries to speed off. We started going down the road, but then one of the tires blew. We are now on the side of the road again, and we just sit there not wanting to get out. It's quiet again. The feeling of being watched is still there. Luckily for us, a guy in a truck pulls up behind us. I feel safe right now. The guy pulls over and helps Chris arrange the tire. I hold my phone with a light, with my back to the woods. I still have that feeling. I want to turn and see what's there, but I dare not. Something is telling me to stay put. After the tire gets fixed, we head to the huddle house nearby to calm down. The poor lady working that night sees something wrong, and with what little money we have, the lady helps us pay for the meal. The next few days, strange things start happening around my house. For example, I'm in the kitchen fixing something for lunch. My roommate and I are talking like normal, and the cutting board goes flying across the kitchen. She gives me this look and says, "See what you caused? Stuff keeps happening for no reason, all because you went to that haunted place." I picked up the cutting board, and at this point feel like I need to make things right. I've always been told that if you disturb the dead, you have to make things right. So with that being said, that weekend, I go to see some friends who don't live far from the rock house and tell them I need to go there, so we do. It's daylight this time. Once we get there, I still have this feeling, but I don't say a word. Once we get to the house, my friends go look around. They explore the place inside and out. I look to the left of me and see nothing, but the feeling is there. I walk in the direction that Chris saw something, and I look into the room on the left of me, and the room is full of designs and paint all over it. The whole house is covered in the same way, but there is something about one room. There's a pentagram with all the markings around it. I yell out to my friends that I think someone might have tried to summon a demon, and as soon as the words leave my mouth, something comes crashing down. I nope the hell out of there and start running out of the house, sadly leaving my friends inside but not meaning to. All I do is run through the woods yelling, "I'm sorry," and don't stop until I'm out of the woods. My friends come after me, wondering what's going on, so I tell them about the other night and what had just happened as well. At this point I wanted to leave. We all get in the car. The friend driving goes to start the car and it's dead, just like the other night, but a different car, mind you. My mind goes back to the other night. This big dark creature comes to mind for some reason. I'd never even seen it before. Was it the thing chasing us that night? I try my best not to freak out. I called my roommate to come and collect us. As we were waiting, a car pulls up. He must live on the road and know what happens, and he says that every time someone goes to the house, their car is dead when they get back. He helps jumpstart the car, and we go down the road. I see my roommate and I jump out of the car and jump into mine. I speed off as fast as I can, wanting to get away from this place as quickly as possible. My friends met me at my house and I made a promise to myself to never venture to the rock house again. For some reason, Chris and I stopped hanging out later. We didn't get into a fight or anything, we just stopped being friends, and we never spoke about what happened that night until a few weeks later. We both seemed to have forgotten that night. I called him and asked him what it was that he saw inside the house to make him do what he did. He doesn't remember what he saw. I thought I wouldn't forget, but I did until a few weeks ago. Someone told me that your brain will block out something so traumatizing you don't want to remember what happened. Maybe that's what our brains did for us. It's 2013 now, and I remembered this story recently, as a few friends at my work told me they went to visit the rock house. I told them not to, but they said that they didn't believe in ghosts and wanted to experience something ghostly. I told them to go then, but I would never be going there again, to no one's surprise. Yesterday, I was on my way back home with truck parts that I had picked up and did what I do a lot of the time. I opened up my map on my iPhone and started checking the countryside roads for any cemeteries I wasn't aware of. I go to them and walk through and record audio and video for my own record. I located one on a narrow side road and went to the area. When I got there, I discovered that it was on private property and would be a 10-minute walk through the field to get to it. Not wanting to upset the property owner or get in trouble for trespassing, I went to a house that was next door. back a long gravel lane. As I got closer to the house, it was obvious that it was not being lived in. It was a huge 2-story farmhouse that in its day must have been quite beautiful, I'm sure. I decided to go ahead and knock the door, as I've seen people live in worse conditions and wanted to make at least an effort to knock on the door. Not gonna lie though, this place was unkempt and had a pretty creepy appearance, with tattered curtains on the windows. A few windows had been broken. I opened the screen door and knocked on the door. It swung open when I knocked, exposing the house that appeared to have been quickly moved out of years ago, full of furniture, clothing laying on the floor. The kitchen was visible down the hall from the front door, and I could see the table was still there. I decided to step into the threshold of the doorway and began recording with my iPhone, yelling out, "Hello?" several times, knowing that there was no one there. Within about 45 seconds of stepping in, I was hit full on the front of my body with an air so cold that it was like stepping outside in the winter night with just shorts on. It was very cold air. Now the outside temperature was about 60 degrees and had been warm for several days. The house was not cold when I stepped in, but this cold air that hit me started to slowly move up my lower legs. Now, as this took place, my lower left leg, just above the ankle, began to feel as if I was being ate up by fire ants, but there were no ants. I asked out loud, "If you're doing this to me, please stop because it hurts." And after asking several times and explaining that I was not there to do anything to the house or property, the burning sensation stopped, but the very cold air remained. I made my intentions very clear and never moved further into the house. I asked the usual questions and panned to my left and right, capturing each room off to the side and the staircase that was directly in front of me. Just as I stated that I was going to leave and would maybe come back someday, I observed with the naked eye a misty apparition cross in front of me from left to right, which I also captured on my phone. I was by myself, I wasn't smoking, and there was no fog or mist outside to come inside. The feeling that accompanied this was dark, ominous, and unwelcoming. I've been to many cemeteries and other places over the years, and I've never witnessed anything like this. I'm somewhat skeptical and always try to debunk anything that I get, but this one has me speechless, and I will definitely be trying to locate the owner in an attempt to see if I can get permission to investigate further one day. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's exploration into unknown and abandoned places, or urbex as some people call it. I certainly had a good time recording these stories for you, and I would love to get your comments and thoughts. I'd like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and members. In fact, my patrons decided via exclusive poll that this was the video they wanted for today. If you would like to join my membership or Patreon and find out how you can get some cool exclusive perks, the links are in the description. But for now, more links on screen for even more videos. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.